In an unbelievable twist, a teacher sent a girl home without pants. Little did anyone know that her father was none other than Clint Eastwood, and what happened next shocked everyone. The old typewriter keys stammered beneath Margaret's trembling fingers. The dimly lit attic was eerily quiet, except for the rhythmic tapping and occasional sob that escaped her lips. Her body hunched forward, a protective curve around the decades-old Remington, as if it were a lifeline. Outside, the small Pennsylvania town slept under a blanket of early autumn fog, unaware of the confession taking shape on paper. "I need to tell you about the night your mother disappeared," she typed. At 62, Margaret's hands weren't as steady as they once were, especially tonight. The letter was addressed to her granddaughter Emily, who would arrive tomorrow for her 30th birthday. 3 decades of silence hung in the balance as Margaret confronted the truth that had defined and destroyed their family. The phone beside her buzzed. It was Clint calling again, the 3rd time tonight. Her brother's name illuminated the screen like an accusation. She let it ring until the screen went dark. Margaret pulled the half-finished page from the typewriter and held it to the light. The truth looked different in physical form, more dangerous somehow. She knew that once Emily read these words, there would be no going back. The careful walls she'd built around their lives would crumble. The floorboards creaked behind her. "You always were stubborn," Clint said, his voice low and menacing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him enter the house. 30 years we've kept this buried, and now you want to dig it up?" Margaret didn't turn around. "Emily deserves the truth." "The truth?" Clint laughed, a hollow sound that scraped against the silence. "The truth won't bring Rachel back. It'll only destroy what's left." When Margaret finally faced her brother, she saw the gun hanging loosely at his side. Her breath caught. "What are you doing?" "Protecting our family, just like I've always done." His eyes were cold, determined. "I won't let you ruin everything." Margaret stood slowly, the typed confession clutched to her chest. "Rachel was my daughter. And Emily is what matters now." Clint raised the gun. "I'm sorry, Maggie, I really am." In that moment, Margaret knew that the silence had been far heavier than she'd realized, and breaking it might cost her everything. 3 months earlier, the Bronze Kettle Cafe hummed with the familiar rhythm of small-town life. Margaret wiped down the counter with practiced strokes, pausing occasionally to refill coffee mugs and exchange pleasantries with the regulars. Her cafe had been the heart of Millfield for nearly 25 years, and at 62, she'd become something of an institution herself. "Mail's here, Mom." Vincent, her son, dropped a stack of envelopes beside the register. At 35, he still had the same serious expression he'd worn as a child, though grey now peppered his temples. He'd moved back home 5 years ago, after his divorce, taking up residence in the apartment above the cafe. Margaret flipped through the stack until a cream-colored envelope with familiar handwriting caught her eye. "Emily." Her heart leapt as she tore it open. "What's that?" Vincent asked, refilling the napkin dispensers. "It's from Emily," Margaret replied, unfolding the letter. "She's coming for a visit." Vincent stiffened. "When?" "Her birthday. She'll be 30. Margaret couldn't keep the smile from her face, though Vincent's expression remained guarded. Emily was the only piece of Rachel that Margaret had left. Her granddaughter had moved to California after college, calling occasionally but visiting rarely. The distance had been a relief to Clint and Vincent, but for Margaret, it was a wound that never healed. "Does Uncle Clint know?" Vincent asked, his voice tight. "Not yet." Vincent shook his head. "You should tell him. You know how he gets about family matters." Family matters, such a benign phrase for the darkness that bound them. Later that evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, stroking the edges of Emily's letter. The decision had been forming for months, perhaps years, a quiet rebellion gathering strength with each passing day. Rachel's face, frozen forever at 25, haunted her dreams. The official story, repeated so often it had calcified into truth, was that Rachel had abandoned her baby daughter and run away with a boyfriend no one had met. A tragedy, yes, but one that happened to other families. The lie had served its purpose. It had kept Emily from asking too many questions. It had allowed her to grow up without the shadow of something far worse hanging over her. But Margaret had watched the girl struggle with abandonment issues her whole life, had seen the way Emily flinched whenever motherhood was mentioned. The lie had protected her from one pain only to inflict another. Margaret reached for her phone and dialed Clint's number. "Emily's coming for her birthday," she said when he answered. A long pause followed. "That's nice," Clint finally replied, his tone neutral. At 68, her brother had mastered the art of hiding his emotions. As Millfield's former sheriff and current mayor, he'd built a reputation on steady reliability. Only Margaret knew what that steadiness cost and what it concealed. "I'm going to tell her the truth," Margaret said, the words rushing out before courage deserted her. The silence that followed was absolute. When Clint spoke again, his voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "We agreed, Margaret. We agreed 30 years ago. She deserves to know what happened to her mother. What happened was tragic, but opening this now won't bring Rachel back. It'll only destroy Emily." His voice hardened. "I won't let you do this." "It's not your decision." "Think about Vincent," Clint countered. "Think about this town, about everything we've built." Margaret closed her eyes against the familiar manipulation. "I've thought about nothing else for 30 years. "I'm coming over," Clint said. "Don't do anything until I get there." But Margaret had already hung up. She climbed the stairs to the attic where boxes of Rachel's belongings had been stored since that night. One by one, she brought them down. Rachel's journals, her photography portfolio, the half-finished application to art school. Her daughter had been so vibrant, so determined to capture beauty in a world that had ultimately shown her none. The photograph at the bottom of the last box made Margaret's hands shake. Rachel at the quarry, laughing with Vincent and Hank Logan, Clint's son. The three of them had been inseparable since childhood. The image was taken 2 weeks before Rachel disappeared. Before everything changed. Margaret slipped the photo into the pocket of her cardigan. Some truths couldn't stay buried forever, no matter how deep you dug the grave. Emily's arrival breathed new life into the old Victorian house. At 30, she had Rachel's laugh and curious eyes, though her cautious nature was all her own. A product, Margaret suspected, of growing up believing she hadn't been wanted. "This town never changes," Emily said on their third day together, gazing out. The cafe window at Millfield's main street. "It's like stepping into a time capsule." Margaret smiled, though her heart raced. Each day brought her closer to the confession she'd rehearsed countless times. "Some things change," she said. "You just can't see it from the surface." Emily turned to her, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Is everything okay, Grandma? You've seemed, I don't know, on edge since I arrived." "Just old bones," Margaret lied. "Nothing to worry about." The bell above the door chimed as Clint entered, his imposing frame filling the doorway. Though retirement had softened him somewhat, he still carried himself with the authority of his years in law enforcement. "Uncle Clint!" Emily rushed to embrace him. Despite everything, she had always adored her great-uncle, the man who had stepped in as a father figure when her own grandfather had died before she was born. Clint's eyes found Margaret's over Emily's shoulder, a silent warning in their depths. "Emily, you get more beautiful every time I see you," he said, his voice warm with genuine affection. "Has your grandmother been spoiling you?" "Trying to," Emily laughed. "But I've been kidnapped by Vincent for the local history museum, and Hank for some fishing trip." "Hank always did have a soft spot for you," Clint said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Later, as Emily helped Vincent with the lunch rush, Clint cornered Margaret in the kitchen. "Have you told her anything?" he demanded, his voice low. Margaret continued slicing tomatoes. "Not yet." "Good." Clint stepped closer. "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. Emily deserves something more than what we've given her. So I've made arrangements." Margaret set down the knife. "What kind of arrangements?" "I'm putting her name on the deed to the lake house. It'll be hers after I'm gone. And I've set up a trust." His expression softened. "She can have a future here, Maggie. A real connection to this place, to us. Isn't that better than destroying her with the past? The manipulation was as elegant as it was expected. Clint had always been skilled at offering alternatives that protected his interests while appearing generous. The truth isn't something you can buy your way out of, Margaret said quietly. Clint's face hardened. This isn't just about Rachel anymore. It's about this town, about Hank's position as district attorney, about Vincent's future here. One selfish decision, and you'll tear down everything. Selfish? Margaret's voice trembled with suppressed rage. My daughter is dead, Clint. Dead. And we've been living with her killer for 30 years. Keep your voice down, Clint hissed, glancing toward the door. I can't do this anymore, Margaret said, fatigue suddenly weighing on her. I see her everywhere. In Emily, in this town, in my dreams. Rachel deserves justice. Justice? Clint laughed bitterly. There's no justice in this, only consequences, and they won't fall on just one person. Emily appeared in the doorway, her expression confused. Is everything okay? Clint stepped back, his face instantly transforming into the benevolent uncle. Just catching up with your grandmother. Those tables won't serve themselves, though. After Emily left, Clint leaned in close to Margaret. 1 week, he whispered. Give me 1 week to make this right. Then we'll decide together what Emily needs to know. But as Margaret watched him leave, she knew his version of right would only sink them deeper into the quicksand of lies that had been slowly suffocating her for 3 decades. That night, Margaret took Emily to the quarry. The flat expanse of water reflected the stars above, the surrounding cliffs casting long shadows across its surface. This place had been Rachel's favorite, the subject of many of her photographs. Your mother used to come here to think, Margaret said, as they sat on a large flat rock near the edge. She said it was the only place where she could hear herself clearly. Emily ran her fingers over the smooth stone beneath them. I wish I could remember her, she said quietly. Sometimes I dream about her, but I don't know if the face I see is really hers or just from the photos you've shown me. Margaret took a deep breath. Emily, there's something I need to tell you about your mother. Emily stiffened. I know she didn't want me. You don't have to protect me from that anymore. No, that's not. Margaret's voice broke. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. She would never have left you willingly. Emily's eyes widened. What are you saying? Before Margaret could continue, headlights appeared on the dirt road leading to the quarry. Clint's SUV pulled up beside Margaret's car, and he emerged, followed by Vincent and Hank. I thought I might find you two here, Clint called, his casual tone belied by the tension in his stride. Hank approached with a forced smile. At 45, he had his father's build and authoritative presence, though his features were softer. As district attorney, he'd built his career prosecuting the crimes that his father had investigated as sheriff, a family legacy of justice that Millfield celebrated. Emily, Hank greeted her warmly. Dad mentioned you were in town. I was hoping to catch you at the cafe tomorrow. Emily smiled, but confusion clouded her expression. What are you all doing here? Vincent avoided Margaret's gaze. Family meeting, he said. Uncle Clint thought we should all be together. At the quarry at night? Emily looked between them. Clint placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. Let's head back to town. We can talk at my house. Margaret stood her ground. We're fine here, Clint. Mom, Vincent warned. Not like this. The tension crackled between them, decades of unspoken truth hovering like electricity before a lightning strike. Emily took a step back, sensing the undercurrents she couldn't yet understand. What's going on? She demanded. What aren't you telling me? Hank stepped forward. Emily, this is complicated. There are things about the past that... Your mother didn't leave you, Margaret interrupted, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She would never have abandoned you. Margaret, Clint growled, stop this now. But 30 years of silence had built up too much pressure. The truth erupted from Margaret like lava. Rachel was killed right here at this quarry, she said, her eyes never leaving Emily's shocked face. And the man responsible has been walking free all these years. The world seemed to freeze. Emily's face drained of color as she looked from Margaret to the men standing rigidly before them. "What?" she whispered. Who killed her?" The weight of the moment pressed down on Margaret, a physical force threatening to crush her. But as she opened her mouth to speak the name that had haunted her for 3 decades, a sudden movement caught her eye. Hank lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "Enough," he shouted, grabbing Margaret's arm with bruising force. "You promised, all of you promised." Vincent moved to pull his cousin away. "Hank, stop. This isn't helping." In the struggle, Margaret was knocked to the ground, the photograph of Rachel slipping from her pocket and landing at Emily's feet. Emily picked it up with trembling hands, staring at the image of her mother laughing beside Vincent and Hank. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small and lost. "Why would you hide this from me? Why would you let me believe she didn't want me?" Clint stepped between Emily and the others. "It was to protect you," he said. "We all agreed it was better this way." "Better to believe my mother abandoned me?" Emily's voice rose with disbelief. "How is that better?" "Because the truth would have destroyed you," Hank said, his anger collapsing into something more desperate. "It would have destroyed all of us." Emily backed away from them, clutching the photograph to her chest. "I want to know exactly what happened to my mother," she said, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "I want to know everything. Right now." The tableau held for a long moment. Emily standing apart, demanding the truth. The 3 men, their secrets suddenly exposed. And Margaret, who had finally broken the silence that had claimed half her life. It was Vincent who finally spoke, his voice hollow with resignation. "It was an accident," he said. "We were all out here that night. Me, Rachel, and Hank. We'd been drinking. Hank and Rachel got into an argument." "It wasn't just an argument," Margaret cut in. "Hank had been obsessed with Rachel for years. She'd rejected him repeatedly. That night he wouldn't take no for an answer." Hank's face crumpled. "I loved her," he whispered. "I just wanted her to listen." "You pushed her," Vincent continued, unable to stop now that the dam had broken. "You were angry and you pushed her. She fell and hit her head on the rocks. We tried to help her, but..." Emily's hand flew to her mouth, a muffled sob escaping between her fingers. "It was an accident," Clint insisted, his voice firm. "A terrible accident, and we made a decision that night, all of us, including your grandmother, to protect Hank. And to protect you from growing up in the shadow of this tragedy." "You lied," Emily said, her voice thick with tears. "All of you. For 30 years. Margaret moved to her granddaughter's side. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she said, "but Clint convinced me it was better for you not to know. That it would only cause you pain." "And what about justice for my mother?" Emily asked, stepping away from Margaret's outstretched hand. "What about what she deserved?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The attic was quiet except for the clacking of the typewriter keys. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the quarry. Emily had stayed, though the weight of truth had created chasms between them all. Hank had turned himself in to the state police the day after, confessing to involuntary manslaughter and the subsequent cover-up. Clint had resigned as mayor, his reputation in tatters. And Margaret had begun to write the full story, every detail she knew, and those she'd learned since. The truth Emily deserved to have in its entirety. The phone beside her buzzed with Clint's 3rd call of the night. He was desperate to stop her, to contain the damage that was spreading through their family like wildfire. But Margaret wouldn't be silenced again. When the floorboards creaked behind her, she knew who it was before she turned. "You always were stubborn," Clint said, his voice low and menacing. 30 years we've kept this buried, and now you want to dig it up?" The confrontation that followed, his desperate threats, the gun, was the culmination of decades of suppressed truth. As Clint raised the weapon, Margaret clutched the pages to her chest, finally understanding the true weight of silence. A floorboard creaked again, and Clint spun around to find Emily standing in the doorway, her phone held out in front of her. "I've been recording everything, Uncle Clint," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "The police are already on their way." Clint's hand trembled, the gun suddenly heavy in his grip. "You don't understand what this will do," he said, but the fight was draining from him. "It will destroy us all. We were destroyed 30 years ago." Margaret said quietly. "We just didn't know it." When the police arrived minutes later, Clint surrendered without resistance. As they led him away, the weight that had pressed on Margaret's chest for 3 decades began to lift. The truth, with all its pain and consequences, was finally free. In the days that followed, Emily and Margaret began the painful process of rebuilding. They visited Rachel's unmarked grave in the woods near the quarry, where Vincent had led them with tears streaming down his face. They brought her home at last, giving her a proper burial in the town cemetery, her name etched in stone for all to see. "I'm not sure I can forgive any of you," Emily said, as they stood beside the fresh grave, autumn leaves swirling around their feet. "But I'm trying to understand." Margaret took her granddaughter's hand. "Understanding is enough for now," she said. "The rest will come with time." The truth had indeed brought destruction, just as Clint had warned. But standing there, in the fading light, Margaret realized it had also brought something else, the possibility of healing. The weight of silence had been replaced by the burden of truth, heavier in some ways, but one they could finally bear together in the open air.